Welcome into the Crypto Bunker podcast. Today, I want to look at Bitcoin and assess where we are in the cycle. And is this the top? Once again, I am asking the question because with Bitcoin, if you are trading Bitcoin, and I don't recommend necessarily doing that. But if you are riding the cycle, you do need to be aware, especially if you're someone who bought in sort of significantly, I would say lower. um, you will want to be aware of the cycle changing. One of the most important things for this is the bullish and bearish trend tracker. Right now, we are bullish trend. As you can see, the buy trade 102,903, sell trade 111,018. According to Keith, we have broken the trade. So there's two things. There's trade and trend. Trade is a little bit more short term. Trend is a little bit more long term. Um, I would call trend like midterm, actually, and trade probably more short term. So that's something to understand, something to know and look at and comprehend for where we are in the cycle. We still are bullish, but we really haven't rallied a lot. And the question is, when we're looking at this pattern here on the weekly time frame, are we seeing potentially a bull flag? I would say a lot of people, you could make the case, a very good case so far, that we are just consolidating within a bullish trend. And I could totally buy that. I can understand that. I can sympathize with that. Excuse me. And I can also sympathize with the people who are saying, okay, we're seeing a lot of sell action here. We saw some buy action, some sell action. Um, you know, there's times in Bitcoin when you're at the top, you're not necessarily looking for those types of candles, I would say. We can compare this candle to something sort of like this, which would be good, right? We have, this bullish candle, then we have a bearish candle, then we have another bearish candle. So, is that sort of what we're looking at? It's hard to say. We also have an example here of these two sort of candles, bearish and then bullish. And then, obviously it was a longer sell-off until we reached that bottoming process there. Another thing to look at, which I think is really important because it worked last cycle, it worked to a T. And I think that we have a really good example of this, and this is the RSI. Okay, so this is a weekly RSI, so it's more important than just a regular RSI, right? So if we're looking at this, we're seeing a clear trend here in the 2020, 2021, right? Where we see, higher highs, slightly higher high. Okay, we have the high that is put in well before, even before this high. Okay. And this high is pretty much put in where we are losing RSI strength. And so we sold off hard here. And we know that this pump was kind of a manipulation by FTX and by the people who are borrowing Bitcoin and all of that. So in all reality, we can say that this was the top. And that is shown in the RSI being as high as it was. It was at, 93. And we now have here where we had a big rally and we rallied up, here and here. And in those moments, we saw the RSI get to around 88, not as quite as strong as this RSI, but there also wasn't as much money printing as there was then, right? So now what we're seeing is progressively, we're seeing this the weakening RSI, just like here, because it was so obvious that this was the top. Because look at the RSI compared to this RSI. It's very simple, and we can look at the MACD, which is even, I think, a better indicator for this. And it's really kind of scaring me because um, understanding, where Bitcoin could be going, is really important, and this is going to help us indicate that. When we look at the MACD, okay, what we are seeing is a similar result again to 2021. And why is that? Well, we have a diminishing green volume coming in. Okay, so what we had is we had green here. We can see the big RSI that is shown here. Then the small RSI here. We had a red. So we have green, a big red come in, right? And then a small green and a small RSI. And that was the top. Okay, it's perfectly in correlation with this lower green. Now what we're seeing here, again, big green, big red, small green, right? RSI weakening, higher high. Okay. It's very simple. It's very simple. And I think people are missing this. They're getting taken, for, again, the bullish sentiment and the bullish talk of all these Bitcoin treasuries, and the government is in on Bitcoin, and all of this type of talk was the same thing that was happening back here. People were saying it was a super cycle, that we were going to go to 150K. And so when you see people starting to make these higher targets and saying it's automatically going to go to 1 million and all these things, you need to be aware that we could be in for a surprise to the downside. And I'm not talking about just a regular surprise. Let's make another comparison. Now, let's look at, when did the Russia-Ukraine war begin? Okay. It was around this area here. Okay. So, we obviously had this sell-off here, which one could argue was smart money getting out. And then we had an obvious, sort of situation where we had, this boot basically, bear pennant, and it was obvious that it was going to fulfill that prophecy there. We haven't quite had that yet at all here. So, but what you do need to know is that the trend for Bitcoin, according to Hedge Eye process right now, is give or take right around 100K. So pretty simple. If we lose the 100K level, we go to a bearish trend. And that is when you want to sell any trade that you might have on. So, and honestly, like, what you need to otherwise look for is the fact that we have broken trade is important. The second thing that's important is the top end of the risk range, which is 111,018, is that higher or lower than the all-time high that we just put in? Okay. And what we can see here is that the all-time high is 111,983. So we are below the all-time high. So that's another thing to look for. The third thing to look for would be breaking trend, right? That's the next step. And it's also, suspect that Marathon Digital has gone neutral trade, or sorry, neutral trend. So it is trending down. We also see that Solana is experiencing bearish trend. We also see Avalanche, bearish trend. And then we have Aave, which is now listed in here, bullish trend. But, there's not been much follow through from these assets, um, especially Bitcoin. It's eerily similar. I've already shown you the similarities from this cycle here. And I can match this up almost exactly. It's not going to be perfect, but I would argue that it's very similar. Okay. The price action, the price chart, it's very, very similar. Especially during that sell-off period where it was a big shakeout, and then now we experience this slightly higher high here. And then, inevitably, imagine Bitcoin going to 50K from here. That would be a disaster, but it would shake everyone out of this sort of bullish sentiment. And it would shake a lot of these new Bitcoin treasury companies out. Maybe they'd go out of business. Maybe they'd have to puke their coins. We know that Michael Saylor's average cost now is probably like 72K. And if we start to really test that and go below it, and he loses his volatility and he loses his premiums on his stock, it becomes more and more of a Ponzi. Um, obviously MSTR, we can also look at the MACD for this and see where we're at. It's not looking good. And I actually would argue that MSTR might be showing us the way more than anything else. And this is not a good sign. So what we're seeing now with MSTR is actually, it did not make a higher high. It actually made a lower high. That's insane. So Bitcoin made a higher high and MSTR made a lower high. Now, why is that? Let's look at the MACD. We had a massive, massive green rally here, big rally. And you could say, yes, that doesn't count, but does this count? I would say yes. It's still lower than even that. Then we have big red. Then we have very small green, okay? We're talking about an obvious situation here. And the trend line for this is not far away. When we look at that longer term trend line that was drawn there, sorry, I drew it incorrectly there. But we can see essentially that it's getting closer and closer to that trend line. Now, Coinbase is mooning, so it's a little bit confusing. But let's take a look at that MACD. Okay, so again, what are we seeing? We're seeing big green, big red, sort of a small green, right? Sort of a small green. So I would argue we're not making a higher high. We could make a higher high, but we're not currently. So again, is MSTR showing us the way? Maybe. Let's take a look at the RSI for this as well. And again, very much not looking good. In fact, it's eerily similar to this blow off, right? So we had this blow off here, and again, kind of crazy. Actually, it blew off here more than it did here in terms of the RSI. So now we are experiencing a third lower high in the RSI. Just like it made again, lower high in the stock price, just like it did here, right? Just like it did here, it did here. Okay. And what we saw with the RSI, similar. Okay. Similar level, actually. Similar level. Okay. So Let's take a look now at a few other asset classes. Let's look at the S&P. Now, what are we seeing on the S&P? We're seeing all-time highs. Okay, all-time highs. Let me get this out of the way. I apologize. So what we're seeing is we had all-time highs. Now we have a lower high. Okay, so the S&P made a lower high as Bitcoin made a higher high. Sort of, I want to say that's similar to what happened. It's not. The S&P did make a higher high, but guess what? The NASDAQ, the NASDAQ topped when Bitcoin topped. The S&P topped after Bitcoin had already topped. Is that going to happen again? I don't know. What we can say is that the RSI is continually getting weaker. So we have a double top scenario. So we had one top, a double top. Look at the comparison, okay? These are lower RSI numbers, okay? It just doesn't look good. It just doesn't. Now, is the MACD going to look a little weird because, yes, it will, because it's just been so weak on the RSI that it almost is just like the MACD is kind of a weird, it's in a weird spot with this. But I will say it is a green, it is a bigger green than we saw for this high, which is a good sign. It's cross bullish on the weekly MACD RSI. And so, again, what are we looking at here? Are we looking at a scenario that the S&P could make an all-time high? Yeah, we could be. I'm suspect of that. I do think when you see a big red MACD like this, it's, it doesn't get resolved immediately, right? We had this big red and then we did recover, not as much as we did here, and then we sold off again. So just to be aware that the stock market is increasingly not reflecting the fundamentals of the real world. And so does it just do that all at once? I don't know. Let's take a look now at gold and silver. Okay, so what we see with silver is a breakout. Now, it's interesting because, to me, this MACD doesn't necessarily look super unhealthy. It doesn't look, like anything is really going on. What we can see is that we did see a green and then a small red and then a bigger green, which is good. So this was really the time to buy when it went back to 29. I did snag a little bit of silver there. I then sold here, which was a mistake, and now we're breaking out. But are we topping out? I'm seeing maybe a short-term top. I don't know. Let's take a look at the daily. Um, Again, looks really good. Looks like it just a pure breakout on the daily time frame. Let's take a look at the RSI on silver, and then we'll look at gold. So RSI is obviously towards the top, but it's not anywhere near where we've seen in the past. And right now, the silver chart in general is just looking so bullish. It's pretty scary, actually, because, obviously we knew that that was the breakout here, but then we're sort of just going higher and higher. And it's similar to me. It's very similar to back in this area here. Okay, now this is never going to match up perfectly, but it is pretty similar to this situation here. Okay, we obviously have been tracking that and it is playing out pretty well. So that would bring us to around $82. And that's sort of been something I've been talking about for a while. And I'm not, I can't claim to be, making good on this trade right now. Another one we've looked at in the past is mag silver, real quick. It is in a situation where it's kind of going to reach this 30 level, which is another maybe 50% gain from here. So that could look good for sure. I think we are due for a pullback, but let's see what it looks like. GDX, okay, same thing. It is starting to look like it could make a new all-time high. And then, the RSI is not really that overdone. Um, it's something that hasn't saw super momentum. We have platinum breaking out to the upside heavily. Is it due to check back a little bit? Yes, maybe. Last time the RSI was this high was obviously the top, but look at all the RSI hits on the top before we got to a top here. So I think we're in early innings on platinum. I think it could make a new all-time high, which would be like 100% gain from here. And then we have gold, which, RSI not looking super weak. It's sort of just hitting these top levels, just like Bitcoin did in 2017. It just kept hitting those top levels. It never really wanted to make lower RSI highs. It didn't really want to make higher ones. It just kind of went sideways on the RSI. And that's kind of what we're seeing in the MACD. We are seeing a strong green breakout still. There's nothing really to write home about. And I think that we could still see a higher high than the 3,500 high. I think the next step is, 4,000, probably round numbers, who knows? If we see the Iran-Israel conflict with the US spike higher, we will see these things, get out of control in terms of silver and gold. So just be aware of that. I do think that it will be bearish for Bitcoin and bearish for stocks, but especially Bitcoin. I mean, Iran has a lot of Bitcoin, so just be aware, that the Middle East holds a lot of Bitcoin as well. So I think if we get into a scenario where the US is entering a war with Iran, Bitcoin will sell off and it will be a bear market. Okay, so that's where we're looking at a 50% loss from here. Everyone will freak out. And but that will be, sort of par for the course with Bitcoin. In fact, it would be pretty bullish to only go down to 50K, really. Usually we would go down to like 30K or 25K or something. So, we'll go down to 50K. People will probably call for 20K, and then we'll bottom around, 45, maybe 40K or something. So, that just keep that scenario in mind. I think it gets a little more dangerous now, especially since, all these companies are so leveraged. Can they keep, people buying their stock, buying their preferred stocks, buying their scam this and scam that, whatever. I also think there's a political issue with the fact that Bitcoin is now attaching itself to Trump. It's attaching itself to this sort of scummy, sort of grifty, sort of pillaging sort of thing, where, everyone's just kind of leverage longing with like these bonds they're selling, and it's just kind of it just kind of sucks. I actually think they're really weighing the price down. A lot of people think that it's like bullish and super bullish. To me, when you think about Bitcoin that's held by these corporations, you have to then weigh all of that Bitcoin down with the debt that they use to buy the Bitcoin. That debt does come due. It will need to be paid. It will eventually probably be paid in dilution of the shares because they're not going to sell the Bitcoin unless they're like totally liquidated or whatever, which is much lower levels, probably 20K or something. I don't know what would happen if we got back down to those levels. There's even Justin Sun, who's going to be having a company that's listed on the NASDAQ, which is now going to try to purchase Tron with leverage. So just think about that. Okay, if that's not a top, I don't really know what is, right? So I realized that I also realized too, let me just say that, Bitcoin is not something that is necessarily something to trade. You can look at Bitcoin and say, no matter what happens in the Iran-Israel conflict or World War III or anything like that, the only the thing is you can say that and you can say, hey, look, this is a long-term play. I don't care if it goes down 50%. I'll just buy along the way. I'll stack Bitcoin and it will be cool. It'll be fine. And as a young person, you may think, Bitcoin is hope for you for a financial future. And so I don't want you to give that up. I don't want you to sell that Bitcoin. I don't want you to really sell physical Bitcoin. What I'm saying is that if you're in a retirement account or something, or some kind of account where you're in like a Bitcoin futures thing, or maybe you buy MSTR and like IBIT and stuff like that, you may want to lighten the load, and then plan ahead based on certain things that are happening. I will definitely keep you guys informed in terms of if we switch to bearish trend. I haven't made videos recently because we've just been bullish trend. It's been boring. There hasn't been that many crazy like buying opportunities that have really worked. It's kind of just went straight to 111 and then it just kind of sucks from there, right? There's not really much going on. Um, so just be aware also that historically we are very underbought. Okay. So right now we're in the accumulation zone of the original Bitcoin rainbow chart. I know this is kind of sounds whatever, like stupid, but this is a logarithmic scale chart. It just shows kind of where we've been at. And honestly, like in 2020, 2021, we didn't even really get to a bubble territory. Okay. We were still in like, you know, is this a bubble? It's question. It's not a bubble though. And so can we really say that we want to sell the Bitcoin when still in like a cheap scenario? Probably not. We would want ultimately to wait for a FOMO level or is this a bubble level or sell or max bubble. So this is a good thing to look at just to see long term where we're at right now in terms of the long term view of things. I don't really think we're looking overbought or anything like that. It's just a matter of like the geopolitical situation. The weekly RSI looks trash. We need like a reset of this whole thing at this point. But we can say that on a long-term scale, you can see based on this, we're really nowhere near. We're basically like halfway if you want to, we're not even halfway. Like when you look at a long-term scale, we may be like only at 64K and we'd be like at the bottom of this channel. So is it possible that we're actually in the 2017 scenario where we actually haven't blown off yet, right? And that's kind of was like what I was thinking the past like maybe month or two until I really took a look at that RSI and that MACD. But we could still have this scenario happen if Bitcoin can be what it's supposed to be. And I think that's the issue that I continue to struggle with Bitcoin is that if there is any scenario, like it seems like every time that you think it could work, it doesn't. And there's many arguments people could make in this way. They could say, well, Bitcoin prices things in ahead of time. Okay. Well, gold seems to have run before Bitcoin, and Bitcoin hasn't really caught up. since then. Even Bitcoin to gold ratio, I'm not saying I have that handy here, although I could look it up. Actually, it's right here. Um, it is making again a lower high. Now that is not a good sign. We want it to be making a higher high against gold. And by the way, it still hasn't made a high against gold since 20, let's see, since April of 2021. I mean, okay, do you want to count that? Fine. I would call that another top. It's basically the same level. So, we're on if you're looking over a 4-year time frame, and yes, that is cherry picking, but Bitcoiners are the best at cherry picking the time frames, especially against gold. They'll say, oh, since August 2020, when gold was, at like its 2000 peak, and Bitcoin was still at 10K, then yeah, obviously it's outperformed since then. Um, but if you look at, when Bitcoin topped, obviously it still hasn't gotten back to that point. So isn't that crazy? Like you could literally have bought in gold if you all of a sudden were just like, hey, I want to buy an asset that's going to hold my value, hold its value, and hold my purchasing power. And you said that in April of 2021, which is 4 years ago. It's over 4 years ago. Okay. Bitcoin has not done the job against gold, which is crazy. That's crazy. Um, and again, the RSI is just screaming, and the MACD, like, look at that. That is so weak. It's so, so weak against gold. I wish that I could have a Bitcoin against silver. I don't know if they have that. Um, I don't think they do. I don't think I would be able to pull that up right now. I'm sure I could find it, but I would like to see it. In fact, I mean, I think silver has flipped Bitcoin in terms of yeah, so here we go. Let's see if we can get anything here. Here we go. Let's see this thing. This will be funny. So again, Bitcoin made a lower high against silver in when it just made that high. So there's another signal. If that's not a signal, what is a signal, right? It's a lower high against gold. It's a lower high against Bitcoin. Or sorry, it's a lower high against silver. It's a lower high in MicroStrategy. It's a lower RSI. Okay. All of these things are screaming. And the only reason it made a higher high back here is because this is when silver peaked um in like early 2021. Okay, so it was a weird scenario there. But Bitcoin has obviously massively outperformed silver. But again, I don't know, is this a time where silver now outperforms Bitcoin? I don't I it could be. That could happen. So just be aware of the possibilities. And let's take a look at the RSI here real quick on this as well. Oh, that's a different indicator, but that's okay. So yeah, again, it's weak, and so are equities, but it just keeps getting weaker here as we see it go up here. But again, it made a significantly, I mean, I would say that's pretty significant lower high there. Um, we didn't even get to the high we made in March of 2024, which is more than a year ago. So again, if you bought gold in March of 2024 and you woke up and said, hey, I finally have some money, I want to store my value, there's another time point we can say gold is outperforming Bitcoin. So again, these are just things to look at, things to think about. I hope you got something out of the video today. If you did, please like, subscribe, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.